Hello again, Art History 2 students. I hope you're doing fantastically well. Greetings from Tate Modern in London, and I stand behind one of the great masterpieces of modern art. This is actually a Mark Rothko, a color field image that basically relies on the idea of color sensations. It's large scale, it's overwhelming in these paragraphs of color. The artwork's behind me, and we'll see many more of them as we talk about why this artwork is important and the impact it has on the modern day world. The artwork behind me is worth $70 million. And so much was made of the artwork during Mark Rothko's own life that he used to be able to have you buy an artwork and then change the decoration, the furniture in your house, so you would have exactly the right viewing point within it. In many cases, when you signed off on a contract to buy a Mark Rothko, he would even tell you whether you were allowed to have a television in the room. Here's a key, you were not. And so we are going to talk about the impact that modern art has on the world that we still live in today. As you can see over on the left, modern art goes from 1900 to 1960 and has basically two different concepts that are going to show up within our lecture today. Concept number one is we're going to have to answer, well, I could have made that, and some of it you might have been able to make. A fair amount of this, though, is much more technically advanced than what we actually generally let on, though we are looking at kind of much more simple concepts and the manipulation of materials. And the second thing is, what is the art about? Why does this matter in any capacity? What is the historical referent on why we have a complete orange dot and only an orange dot on the wall at, say, any contemporary art museum that you may go to? This will be that story of modern art. It's also the reason why many individuals, when they think about art today that aren't in the art field, they'll say, well, anyone can do art, and art can mean anything, and art doesn't mean anything because art lost its power. This is the time period where that starts to happen. And at the very beginning, we can thank Picasso for trying to break all the rules of art, as we saw in our last episode under Cubism and Fauvism. Now, as we talked about, 1900 and 1960, brief overview, is one of the most challenging ideas because life is traveling faster than in any other period in human history. And so we are going to run through a number of things which are ultimately going to lead us into World War I and World War II. But think about it. We're going to have the submarine. We're going underwater. We're going actually up into the air. We're actually creating and starting to launch into space at the end of the time period. We are basically solving penicillin. Our population is exploding. We have gotten these national boundaries, and we have different shifting in national boundaries that are taking place. We have the colonial period where we want to go and impose white imperial culture on large, vast swatches of the rest of the world, and they're going to revolt against it at the very end of the modern period. This is going to lead us into World War I and World War II. Technological marvels that caused literally 100 million deaths between that interwar period and the wars themselves, from starvation and hunger, and more people are going to die than actually die from bullet wounds. And we're going to have new diseases and the smallpox. We're going to start to eradicate different things. We're going to go through the Spanish flu. This is a fast-paced environment, more fast-paced than even the environment we live in today. Artists are going to be at the forefront. Note, looking at Cubism, Futurism, Fauvism, and we have just barely started looking at the 19th or the 20th century from 1900 to 1960. Now, as we go through this and throughout the semester, one thing I want to do is I want to track how you are doing and give you an overview. And so this is called Bloom's Taxonomy. So this week, one of the things that I am actually going to be starting to post is I'm going to be posting up on your grade book in Blackboard, the Bloom's Taxonomy that shows up. If you understand, Bloom's Taxonomy basically relates to the different ways that we understand information. From the very basic, the first aspect, remember, what date was Picasso born on? To the understand, why is this important? How did Picasso's art come to be? Why? What does this particular artwork matter? Is Picasso's artwork better than this? Can you manipulate and use Picasso's artwork to tell me what's going to happen in the future after Picasso dies? So we're going to go from basic information to understand, application, analyze, evaluate, and create. I am actually been throughout the semester, I have questions buried in my quizzes, as well as questions that have been buried within our classes, as well as questions that are buried within the homework that you're doing and your midterm exam, where I've been tracking some elements here because I want to see how well, not just remember and understand, that's the basic. Google does fantastically well if you forget an information or a fact, you can look it up. What I want to know is those facts and information that you can analyze and apply them and eventually create your own knowledge base that makes sense from a historic framework that shows up. And so throughout the term, different questions have been pegged to different one of these statures. So at the end of the term, I can give you an overall view of how well do you actually do create for Bloom's taxonomy. Can you create your own understanding based upon just regurgitate what I or what another faculty member or another individual online says? How well can you actually analyze an artwork on your own? And so at the end of the term, I can give my students a pretty good overview of this idea of Bloom's taxonomy and how the individual is doing compared to kind of national standards of people that are coming out with art degree or college degrees as well. So we're being benchmarked within that process based upon my skills. So I can see how well did we develop over time? Did we move from the understand and remember? Remember, think about the 3 questions that you are answering throughout the term. The first question is understand and remember. Why did the artist make this? Can you read and find the information and remember that? The second question, what's new and innovative about this particular artwork? That is the idea of an out. What's new and innovative? How does it change or apply? So it's one of these A words. And the last one, how does the artwork impact the world we live in today? That's evaluate and create. Sometimes analyze, but most often that information is not given to you in the book. And so can you create your own knowledge based upon what you know previously, or at least evaluate, so judge the value of the information or ideas that are presented. So this is something we'll be able to do for you at the end of the term. Now, as we get started from this time period, I want to actually watch a video that makes the case for abstraction. That abstraction is an important concept that shows up from this time period. So here's the case for abstraction.
For much of human history, when people set out to make art, they did so by trying to represent things as they appeared in the world around them. And then, about 100 years ago, a bunch of artists stopped trying to do that. It was shocking. This is not what art was supposed to be or do, and no one was given a compass really for navigating this new art terrain, for interpreting it, for appreciating it. It's less shocking now, but it still upsets and confounds. How are we supposed to deal with an art completely untethered from the world of recognizable objects? And more importantly, why should we? This is the case for abstraction. It's important to note that we didn't just dive headlong into complete abstraction in art. J.M.W. Turner's seascapes, for example, demonstrate that things that exist in the world can often look abstract. James McNeill Whistler's nocturnes show this too, as do Victor Hugo's ink drawings. But as the 19th century unfolded, with the Industrial Revolution and the invention of photography, life in European and American cities changed dramatically. And it should come as no surprise that representations of that life changed too. Artists were increasingly interested in depicting things non-naturalistically, setting about abstracting things, i.e. starting with worldly subject matter, but stylizing it, simplifying it, flattening it. By the 20th century, Matisse and André Derain were painting familiar things but in unfamiliar ways, using such intense colors and broad brushstrokes that a critic dubbed them the fauves, or wild beasts. Picasso and Georges Braque pioneered the Cubist style, painting much of the usual still life fodder, but breaking it up into geometric shapes, fragmenting the picture plane, and showing multiple sides of a thing at once. Cubism simultaneously revealed more than what the eye could see, fusing multiple perspectives and moments in time, while also drawing attention to the flatness of the canvas itself. The Italian futurists wanted to reflect the speed and overstimulation of modern urban life, also collapsing space and time into one image. German expressionist Ernst Ludwig Kirchner used abstraction and rich, unreal colors to depict the chaos and anxiety of the city street. His contemporaries Franz Marc and Vasily Kandinsky cited influences as diverse as tribal art from Africa, medieval German woodcuts, Russian folk art, Art Nouveau, and art by children. But while Marc pursued abstraction to connect with the natural world, Kandinsky's interest was to commune with the spiritual. He claimed his art was, quote, what the spectator lives or feels while under the effect of the form and color combinations of the picture. For Kandinsky, abstraction was not opposed to realism. It was realism. I mean, there are real things that can't be seen, after all. Emotion and consciousness are realities, and maybe they could be painted too. Kazimir Malevich called his brand of abstraction Suprematism, saying his geometric elements, alone and in arrangements, constituted the zero of form, beyond which lay the, quote, supremacy of pure artistic feeling. In the years leading up to World War I, all these groups with names give the false impression that what was happening was cohesive or organized. It wasn't. Abstraction did emerge through an international network of artists who followed what each other were doing. But then again, we now know that Swedish painter Hilma af Klint was painting mostly abstract works as early as 1905. She was part of a group called the Five, who conducted seances to communicate with spirits through pictures. Klint's abstractions came from this interest in the spiritual and occult, as well as science, and the depiction of invisible forces like recently discovered electromagnetic fields, X-rays, and infrared light. Theosophists Annie Besant and Charles Leadbeater had published images in 1901 they called thought forms, illustrating their belief that ideas, emotions, and sounds manifest as visual auras. Kandinsky and many others read this work and also saw in music an important parallel, an art form considered on its own terms and freed from the burden of representing things in the world. Kandinsky liked Wagner and Schoenberg. Paul Klee loved Bach. František Kupka also drew a strong connection between music and painting, believing that without the distraction of subject matter, art could act directly on the soul. But Robert Delaunay was, quote, horrified by music and noise and said, "I never speak of mathematics and never bother with spirit." He was more concerned with the immediacy and pictorial realities of color and contrast, and his first disc was considered the purest abstraction at the time. His wife, Sonia Delaunay, illustrated an influential book of poetry, combining abstraction and typography, a style she extended into painting and later into fashion. Piet Mondrian found his own way to abstraction, translating his favorite subjects like trees and architecture into gridded arrangements. Spatial illusion is replaced by what Mondrian termed truth. For him, everything could be processed into horizontal and vertical lines, revealing the structure of the world through binary oppositions. So abstraction was never monolithic. In the traumatic years of World War I, artists like Paul Klee can be seen as consciously turning away from the material world. Serving in the German army, Klee wrote in 1915, "The more horrifying this world becomes, the more art becomes abstract." After the war, Klee and a number of abstract artists taught at the Bauhaus School, founded in 1919 in Weimar, Germany. It was organized around the principle that the crafts were on equal footing with art, and they sought to elevate the quality of life through architecture and objects as well as art. This focus on function as well as form was also adopted by Theo van Doesburg and members of the Dutch De Stijl group. Theirs was, quote, a new plastic art, a simplified geometric style that could serve as a universal aesthetic language for everyday life. Abstraction also found its way forward through explorations of chance, with Dada artists like Hans Arp collaging squares he dropped arbitrarily onto paper. It wasn't all just painting and drawing either. Abstract sculpture took hold, for instance, in Russia, with the work of Vladimir Tatlin and his professed truth to materials before the war, and Alexander Rodchenko after it. Rodchenko exhibited 3 monochromatic paintings in 1921, after which he wrote, "It's all over. There is to be no more representation." He then denounced painting and fine art altogether, and with the productivists aimed to integrate art into life, focusing on the design of posters and ads. But of course, the enterprise of abstract painting would continue to go on, and and all with different motivations. There was Ella Zitsky, Marsden Hartley, Juan Miró, Alexander Calder, Arshil Gorky, and many others in many parts of the world. During World War II, many European artists fled to the US and worked there, including Joseph and Annie Albers, Fernand Léger, Mondrian, Jacques Lipschitz, Hans Hofmann, André Masson, and Max Ernst, bringing new approaches to abstraction with them. That influx of avant-garde thinking is considered to be an important precondition for the success of the abstract expressionists in New York in the 1940s and 50s. Many of those guys looked to ancient myths and archaic cultures in search for timeless subject matter, and were influenced by Jungian psychology as well as jazz. This largely improvisational approach imparted a kind of directness and immediacy meant to provoke strong emotional responses through large-scale and either dynamic gesture or expansive fields of color. The Gutai group in Japan also embraced the canvas as an arena for action, Kazuo Shuraga even painting with his feet. There was post-painterly abstraction with Helen Frankenthaler and Morris Lewis, and hard-edge abstract painting, which can be used to describe the work of Ellsworth Kelly, Kenneth Noland, Felrath Hines, Agnes Martin, and Ad Reinhardt. There was op art, and of course minimalism, which seemed to boil art down to its most basic materials. And then post-minimalism, which emphasized unconventional materials in the physical process of making. There was neo-expressionism in the 1980s, conceptual abstraction in the 90s. We're skipping over scads of important and interesting work here. But as we hurtle toward the present, it becomes clear that abstraction has been deployed by a wide range of artists toward innumerable ends. Abstraction is no longer an iconoclastic choice, but it has nonetheless proved itself to be a productive field for those who commit themselves to it. The most compelling abstract work being made today often builds upon the traditions of the medium, recycling and reinterpreting prior approaches toward the creation of something new. Abstraction can be used to think about technology, its forms and functions, and also the denial of technology through an emphasis on tactility and physical presence. It also continues to ask us, what is the right and wrong way to make art? In what ways can we still intrigue the eye and mind? There's a fair bit of grumbling today about how the current inflated art market unfairly privileges abstract painting, but there's something important at play in that fact. Much can be contained in abstraction. It's not just one thing. It can be a mirror or a window, and it can shift depending on who is looking at it and where and when. It is done well and it is done poorly, but the flexibility that makes it open to interpretation also makes it market-friendly and international. When it's good, it rewards longer stints of looking. It changes as you change, but that expansiveness can also be frustrating, too wide. But if we zoom out, we can see that many of the core ways we have of interacting with the world are abstract. Religion, markets, currency, and humans have always liked abstractions. We see abstract patterns way early on in cave carvings, and as marks on pottery and textiles. Geometric marks and forms have been with us all along, often dismissed as decoration or relegated to the world of craft. This whole narrative is a farce if we consider how long abstraction has been with us, that it was not invented so much as discovered or accepted. When looked at a different way, what's strange may be the period when humans did not embrace abstraction.
And so with that introduction to abstraction, we have to talk about not just how we get here, but how these different movements base upon one another, because it is a convoluted kind of group that develops from 1900 to about 1960, and then beyond into the modern abstraction market. The real basis that we can start looking at post-cubism is the idea of the armory show from 1913, which we looked at before, that where we really have most hated artwork at the armory show, that nude descending a staircase. Here's the slide making fun of that again, the rude descending a staircase, where we do have abstraction next to absolute beauty and perfection. And that is what the art market post-Beethoven and the idea of breaking the patronage system actually allows. So as we talked about this artwork specifically, this is an artwork that's just crazy in terms of how important it is for answering these or asking these questions. And note, abstractions then are going to have different ways of dealing with it. What is art? Is the color paragraphs before me, which anyone appears that they think they can do, try it. It's actually quite difficult. Does the artist's opinion matter about art, or is it someone else? Who determines what is and isn't art? Can you make art without talent? Can you make art without using your talent if you do have talent? Can art be made in mere minutes? Can you take non-art, a ready-made, and make it into art, as Marcel Duchamp is still in the modern day world? And is the concept behind the art more important than the real art? A lot of this comes out of the movements, as we talked about in art history too, where we looked at the impacts of World War I, the interwar period, and then the impacts of World War II, which we'll talk about today, where we have abstraction, cubism, Dada up here, and the idea of futurism and 20 million casualties. So in the aftermath of World War I is really where we pick up our story. Society then realized that technology is a tool. Society and technology can be used for both good and evil, which they didn't think about before. Technology was going to be all good early on in the 20th century, and then we have that terrible World War I. And the artists then are going to be looking for something that's not going to offend other individuals. They start looking for spirituality, a connection with God. A lot of these artists actually end up becoming, if not atheist, at least agnostic, really questioning God, because if this is what can happen with science and technology in the future of positive movement, wow, we have lost our way. We need a God for morality to help guide us. So the one we want to start off with is this individual here. So this is the style, also referred to as, you can see over here, the style, the style, or sometimes it's called neoplasticism, but I'm going to refer to it as the style or the style. Before World War I, this is what Mondrian is doing. And what art movement is this most likely from? Good. This is kind of the idea of Fauvism or Expressionism, the idea of color used in the way that Van Gogh would use it for an expressionist masterpiece to get emotions across, or Gauguin would use it, or even Matisse or André Derain. So we very much have this color palette. Well, after World War I, he moves from this to these color blocks because he's searching for the spiritual. And he doesn't believe you can find the spiritual aspect in nature. The spiritual is something that's human. Spiritual is something about us that makes us different. So he moves to these compositions called, and the compositions are generally in red, blue, and yellow. We're going to start off with the primary colors. What Mondrian says is the spiritual in art, one will make as little use as possible of reality because reality is opposed to the spiritual. That's an interesting concept because it talks about what non-Western cultures have long known, that there's a visible world that you and I can see, but then there's this less visible world of the gods and the spirits behind us that occasionally appear, but sometimes disappear, just like that. So they appear and they disappear, and it's our job as the artist to see in that spiritual realm, which we have lost because we're so concentrated on the object and on reproducing reality. So when we look at Mondrian, I'll go back one. As we look at Mondrian, and he gets these simple color blocks, he really is looking at these as almost borders, as blockades. Those can be countries, those could be counties, those could be individuals' personal space. It's the idea of be happy on some level, be spiritual within the idea of the balance and order of everything that happens to be there. And so blue should not go over and attack white and make this light blue, right? That's colonization, that's war, that's attacking. That's the idea of, promoting a particular religion over the other, that we have these vested interests on being where we are. And so this is actually the importance of Mondrian's distilled today.
Mondrian is one of the most important artists of the 20th century. He developed the language of abstract painting as we know it today. It didn't really exist before his practice.
Remember, he's willing to leave the object, which the Cubists are not.
So we're standing in the reconstruction of his studio that he occupied from 1921 to 1936. It became one of the most celebrated places in interval Paris. We have a section here around the door where for a short time Mondrian exhibited a number of his kind of key paintings. By the time we get to composition to all of that can trace of reference to.
You'll notice that with the absolute abstraction that shows up, trying as a search for spirituality, what you're ultimately looking at is kind of the development of true conceptual art along the lines of Marcel Duchamp and his Fountain from 1917.
It's a really interesting question he's posing himself here, is that can you use colour just as itself and not to stand for anything else? If you made yellow into a circle, immediately people start making associations with the sun or something like that. So he decides that the only way forward is to paint in areas of perpendicular relationships. But you can still see that he's actually mixing the colour really very dramatically. So the yellow is going almost towards a green, the red towards an orange. He's really still not quite kind of happy with using them in these kind of dramatically dense ways. So here we have compositions from the mid-1920s. This is when Mondrian's really kind of hit his stride. He was very kind of interested in
so this is post-World War I
that actually were unbalanced. See the pushing of elements to the edge.
And the idea that aspect of asymmetry that starts to develop really is an inheritor of Japanese art.
What's going on here is exactly that area there, and how you read that as a definite shape. And it's really, really crucial that you don't read the white just as an empty background. Actually, the whites are very, very carefully built up. This is actually a very pale grey blue, and it's different to that, and that's different to that. They actually stand for something in themselves.
And that's the question for Mondrian then. What do they stand in for as the spiritual realm? Because the spiritual realm is generally an individual realm. And so do they stand in for your pursuit of religion? Do they stand in for countries, for individuals, for color palettes? You get to be a part of the action here. Remember, we're post the idea of the fountain, and so your opinion now matters. Now, the enormous impact that this steel is going to have is largely not just in painting and developing the language of abstraction, but it's also going to be, here's the first of the steel exhibition. It's going to show up in all sorts of modern day, like the Rietveld Schroederhaus, which you still can go visit in Utrecht, Netherlands, in architecture and in beautiful pieces of furniture laid out using basically that grid-like flat structure, trying to get an idea, conceptual, a search for spirituality. Now, because that, how many times do you want to go through and look for the search of spirituality? This is the style is a short movement. Again, lasts for the better part of about 15 years because people on some level think that it's come to its natural conclusion. How small, how large, what can you do to invigorate this particular art form after 15 years of making these geometric abstractions? You can simplify color, you can simplify line, and eventually you can go to just white on white, which is what actually happens, a white square on a white background. Thank you, Malevich. Or you can look at just black square, where we basically disappear into almost nothingness. And when we do that, is that a spiritual concept? And where do we go next? Because once you make it to that level, it's really hard to go any farther within this movement. So most of these art movements in modern art are going to be very short-lived as they search for a fairly precise, finite, using the basic elements of art, color, line, form, shape, texture. And that's what we're going to see. You'll see a huge impact that it still has. This is Pierre Mondrian, even in modern day fashion, and this was from 1960s fashion, from Yves Saint Laurent. And of course, we have memes and GIFs. You've all seen images that look like this before. This one supposedly is an aerial representation that tells people about traffic patterns moving around a modern metropolitan city. Another attempt at this is going to be Suprematism. And so Suprematism here, 1910 to 1930, is an abstract art based upon the idea of the supremacy of pure artistic feeling, rather than on visual depiction of objects. Note, it is very similar and an outgrowth of what actually Pierre Mondrian is doing with the style within the process. But it's the supremacy of pure artistic feeling. There's this idea of randomness, and yet it's organized randomness. The artist chooses the shape, the color palette, how to put them, whether to put them at a diagonal. Very so much later on, we'll see versions of this that are going to lead into things such as the automatic drawing techniques of Joan Moreau. And that's what we're looking at. And eventually this is going to lead us to just black square and white on white by Kazimir Malevich. Note that date 1917, the same date as the fountain, the year that shook the very foundations of what art would be. So here is Suprematism explained. And almost always done with the background of music.
Early 20th century Russia was a complex time, with the people calling for change and the government retaliating with bloody massacres of its own citizens.
So this is one of the most famous movies of all time, called Battleship Potemkin by Sergei Eisenstein, which supported the revolution
forces began to gain popularity.
that eventually Stalin
But
will
elsewhere in
take
Europe,
over.
a new artistic wave bent on subverting tradition swept across the land, that being modernism. Influenced by the Cubists such as Pablo Picasso and George Braque, as well as the Futurists such as Alberto Baccioni and Luigi Russolo, a Russian artist named Kazimir Malevich joined in the movement of Cubo-Futurism, bringing both styles into one. He and other Cubo-Futurists collaborated on a play in 1913 titled Victory Over the Sun. That is nothing compared to some scenes in the play. You can find it for free with English subtitles on YouTube if you want to see the complete insanity for yourself. In designing backgrounds for it, Malevich created extremely minimalist forms, which would go on to inspire the beginning of his new movement, Suprematism, holding up a completely black square as the perfect manifesto for his new abstract work. In 1915, he and his friends organized the first suprematist art show, featuring the black square in the corner of the room, where traditionally religious paintings are supposed to hang.
The visitors left horrified with the art, but it was clear that the revolutionary climate was influencing more than just politics. Then, in 1917, the revolution was a success. In 1918, Nicholas and his family were executed by a group of rebels in their home, and Vladimir Lenin, leader of the Bolshevik Communist forces, led the fight against those still loyal to the past government in the Russian Civil War. 1922 was the year when the Red Bolshevik Army triumphed over the White Loyalists, and Malevich, a communist himself, saw a future of prosperity and endless possibilities in Russian art. During and after the war, new incredible artists joined Suprematism, growing the movement to international fame. Many of them would go on to be major figures in progressing the avant-garde in culture and art mediums. But a much larger Russian art movement began to emerge: constructivism. Many people falsely equate Malevich to constructivism, but he completely disagreed with it. To illustrate the main difference between Suprematism and constructivism, one can use the constructivist painting Beat the Whites with the Red Wedge, which sometimes is mistaken for Suprematism. The red symbolizes the communist forces defeating the white loyalists, which conveys an overt political message, which Malevich was strongly against.
It was about supremacy of spirituality for Malevich.
The real world through advertisement, propaganda, and architecture, adding to society in a productive way, while Suprematism promoted absolute abstraction and a disconnect for all things physical. Malevich held this concept up so high that when he began to notice that his paintings were looking more like depictions of buildings from a low angle, he completely reorganized his methods so no one could confuse them for any physical object. In 1924, Lenin died at the age of 53, and in 1928, Leon Trotsky, who was supposed to be his successor, was exiled, leading to Joseph Stalin's reign of terror as the Soviet leader. His dictatorship commanded in 1932 that all art should be destroyed, except for socialist realism. I wonder why. Soon after his own country betrayed him, Kazimir Malevich passed away at the age of 56. At the funeral, the black square stood strong above him, and also marks his eternal resting place on his grave. Even though his...
So the idea for him was very much the idea of the spiritual essence, of looking at art from a spiritual essence, and that basically the search for the supreme, suprematism. Also emerging, note, in the same time period as the outbreak of World War I and then through World War I, is going to be Vasily Kandinsky, another Russian. His art movement is going to call Blue Rider, and the blue was the color of male spiritual color, and the rider was a relationship to Saint George, the idea of the dragon slayer. So this was a spiritual masculine movement about dragon slaying, about aggression, about the end of the world potentially. He is a pioneer of abstract art. He is a lawyer as well, trained, a well-known profession, and he gives up after seeing a Monet, and he says, I want to make art like that. So he wants to compare or kind of combine basically Buddhism and science, this search for the spiritual, this search for the unknowing energy of the universe and where I fit in. And at the same time, science was actually looking at the search of energy as well. E equals mc squared. We have Einstein later on that's going to come out. He believed that music was the best way to emphasize spirituality, because music is often not associated with a visual image, a thing in the real world. It was about pure feeling, about pure emotion. And so note the very similar kind of goals and ends, but the artwork looks different when we look across things such as Suprematism, when we look at constructivism, when we look at Blue Rider that shows up here. And so he thought that artists were expressing spirituality really through the basic elements of art: the line, color, form, shape, texture, and the aspect of what you're trying to show. Now, unlike Suprematism, you'll note you will see references to the real world here and real stories and mythology, largely inspired by the beautiful music of various different kind of powerful, largely romantic individuals. So one of his favorite pieces of music of all time is Mussorgsky's St. John on the Night. He wants to experience visual art like you experience music. It has to be taught, and people have to have the idea. He believes that naturalism equals materialism, and he was very opposed to materialism. So we want to have this abstract relationship to the real world where, if you look at improvisation number 30 by Kandinsky, Warlike Theme, you'll notice you will still see cannons and cannon fire coming out. You will see marks that show up like the church that show up, but in this beautiful kind of color palette, not in this dark foreboding way, but as if something is going to happen, and this is the way of showing the spiritual nature of what's taking place. So he wants to suggest scenes from End of Days. And he believed, literally believed, that according to a Russian legend, Moscow would become the third Rome at the Last Judgment, right? We had the first, we had Jerusalem, then we had Rome for the crucifixion of Christ. Now at the Last Judgment, that was going to happen in Moscow. And he very much combined elements then of the beautiful color palette of the Last Judgment of Michelangelo with the idea of Russian icon and iconic images about the spirituality, specifically within the Christian world. And he very much is a Christian, as you can see. This is the battle for the end of days over likely the Kremlin buildings with crosses and churches at the top, where as long as you're pure, it doesn't matter if you're Russian, French, communist, capitalist, were you of pure of heart and soul, then you will attain kind of spirituality. So here's an overview of Kandinsky. Note the Ride of the Valkyries, a great thing to show in terms of Kandinsky from the Romantic period.
In this art history video, we'll dive into the world of Vasily Kandinsky. We'll take a look at how Impressionism influenced his early work and how the Bauhaus art movement influenced his later work. We'll also take a look at some of his woodblock prints that we'll use as inspiration for printmaking in our next art project. Kandinsky was one of the leaders of the Blue Rider group of abstract expressionist artists in Germany from 1911 until 1914, when World War I broke out. During World War I, Kandinsky had to leave Germany and return to his home country, Russia, where he would stay until 1921. Now, Kandinsky had grown up in Russia and previously been trained as a musician, and earlier in his life had pursued a career as a teacher in law and economics. It wasn't until the age of 30 that he gave up this career to become an artist. So what influenced Kandinsky to leave this promising teaching career to try something new, to become an artist? Claude Monet and his paintings of haystacks. Kandinsky was struck by how Monet's haystacks had a fairy tale power and splendor. He felt surprised and confused by the painting because he could only see an impression rather than a realistic image of a haystack. In fact, the art movement that Monet led was called French Impressionism. What was Impressionism and why was it so impactful? Not just on Kandinsky, but other painters and also different types of artists, including musicians and even writers. The Impressionists were a group of artists who came onto the scene in Paris in the 1860s. And just like the Blue Riders, the Impressionists were disruptors. They didn't want to paint in traditional ways. They wanted to change the way art was made, even if it meant shocking audiences. They painted in open air instead of inside a classroom, with quick brushstrokes and bright colors. They shocked audiences because their work was made in an untraditional way and looked incomplete. It would have been hard to imagine then that the Impressionist art would be so valuable today, but Kandinsky was mesmerized by Monet's work and ready to apply his own creative concepts to art. Kandinsky explored color, materials, and concepts to innovate new ways of making art. Early on, he used a technique called woodblock printing. Woodblock prints left an impression of the etching on paper, in which you could almost see the grains of wood that he used as part of the process to print. Kandinsky also later painted with oil paints and intense colors. He believed that color was more than just an adjective. It was an object with its own meaning, depth, and purpose. It's even believed that he had synesthesia, which allowed him to see colors when he listened to music. Kandinsky listened to music before or while he painted, and titled many of his works with musical titles, like composition. He once described his unusual sensibility while he was watching an opera performance in Moscow. I saw all my colors in spirit before my eyes. Wild, almost crazy lines were sketched in front of me. In 1921, after spending 7 years in Russia, Kandinsky was ready to try something new. He left Russia once again to live in Germany. There, he taught at the Bauhaus Art School and would develop a new, more minimal way of making art. His work became more geometric in design, and shapes as well as colors began to take on symbolic meaning. In On White too, Kandinsky listened to music while he was painting. For Kandinsky, white represented the endless possibilities available in life. In black, its non-existence and death. Black slices through the white in the painting, much like death can interrupt opportunities in life. But what else was going on at the time when Kandinsky was in Germany in the 1930s? In 1933,
So I wanted to give you an overview of Kandinsky himself, and note the horse, the blue rider that shows up, which is a nice fling around that. So this idea of abstraction is absolutely floating around in the area, both right before World War I with the experimentation of the artists, and in between World War I and World War II, and then during World War II. World War II then comes along in this mass where we have Suprematism and where we have constructivism, where we have Dada and Surrealism still. We still have some individuals that are actually doing futurism, though, as we see with neo-futurists, not with the political destruction and everything, but with the energy and the commotion and the world that's actually taking place. We have all these different art movements, these different new ways of looking at art. We even have in America, amazingly, we are still in realism. We have all these others. We are creating Americana through things such as Norman Rockwell, these beautiful images of what it means to have Thanksgiving Day dinner. All of this comes together. And then World War II happens. And World War II is even more catastrophic and destructive than World War I. And in the aftermath of World War I, and then later on in World War II, we are going to look at the human body, in particularly after the dropping of the bomb, in this eviscerated way. And so individuals really lose touch with reality, except if you look at people who are victims of fire bombings and of nuclear war. These are the images that we see. And this is Alberto Giacometti. If you look at him, it really looks like concentration camp, particularly with the beautiful negative light and space that shows up. You see individuals that are emaciated, emaciated to the point where death can befall them. Even if we find them, we won't have to be able to save them. We'll see the same things about abstracted horses and people with their mouths open, as if it almost looks like Pompeii, but in the idea of their face and everything being incinerated alive. And this is what we're looking at from Giacometti, that terror, that awfulness, that what can man's humanity do to his fellow man and other animal species. And he really is looking at this violent abstract in a very constructivist, a very kind of breaking down the human body form, showing the evisceration of how awful we are as humans, how animal we are to one another. At the end of World War II, then, we as the United States emerged as one of the world's superpowers. We have never been a superpower before. And generally, when you become a superpower, you want superpower art. And this is basically becomes what we are. We have to ask the question for the first time, what does it actually mean to be American? I shouldn't say the first time, the second time, because we are neoclassical George Washington. But in the post-World War II era, what does it now need to be and mean to be an American? We are the 5th largest nation on earth at the time. We still are that kind of that 4th or 5th nation. We have the 4th largest land mass. We still have the 4th largest land mass. Where do we fit in? Because we are now the superpower. So what is it that we want to promote? And so we promote on some level this military, I want you, Captain America, to buy war bonds now. We are going to start selling the American dream. It's not about having stuff. It's about having opportunity. The idea, give me you're tired, you're poor, all those looking for a better life, the poem that comes out of Ezra Pound. That's what we're looking at, and we are going to celebrate this. Now, we are about to get incredibly wealthy as one of the world's only superpowers, along with the Soviet Union and the Cold War starting at this time period. And that is because our factories have not been bombed. The war has largely been fought over in Asia, in North Africa, and in Europe. So those are all in shambles. So the only working factories on the entire planet are here in the United States of America. You want to buy a car, it's going to be made in Detroit. You want to buy a dishwasher, it's going to be made here in the United States. If you want paper, we have the paper mills up in Northwest. We are doing really well, and our economy recovers incredibly well, faster than any other economy, almost in human history, but very close to human history. So we get incredibly wealthy in the following decade. And people are wary of artists. This is an actual 1950s poster in the United States of America. Beware of artists. They mix with all classes of society and are therefore the most dangerous. Remember, a lot of those artists had migrated or emigrated or fled Europe during World War I and World War II and settled in New York City. So a lot of them had much more socialist or even communist leanings. And so we had a Senator Joseph McCarthy, profiling it's the American way, saying if you don't believe in American and capitalism and that we're the best at everything, even when we're not, then you were anti-American and you were a communist. You were supporting the Russians. And we were terrified of this Cold War battle that shows up. So artists, we even blacklisted a number of people, both in the arts, in the music, and in the film industry that were just not capitalist enough for McCarthy. It was enough just to be accused of being anti-American that they would put you on trial. So we need to come up with this idea of superpower throughout history. If you think about Rome, Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, going back into France or in the Napoleonic ages, the Italian Renaissance and the artwork out of the Vatican. When you're a superpower, you have superculture and you have super art. We needed that. Here is the art that we were still promoting. You can't go to the world and say, look at our artwork. This is the same stuff they had been doing since 1850. This is realism. This is American Gothic from the 1930s. Here we have Americana in the 1940s. Here we have Americana also in the 1940s about Nighthawk and what it means to be isolation. So we needed to create an art form that was America. It was about what it was to be an American. So we went on a search and we come up with this idea. So this is our Cold War in art, us versus the Soviet Union. We couldn't go to just Americana anymore. The Soviet Union was doing that with the Soviet Union. Hey, look at what our math and our science and our white, blonde, Christian individuals, look what a powerful world they've created in this very kind of abstract, almost graphic design. That's what the Soviets were pushing as social realist for their time period. So this is going to be dominant all the way into the end of the Soviet Union. And other artwork was largely destroyed or not supported by the government. So we're going to come up with a Congress of Cultural Freedom. We're going to promote American cultural values and counteract Soviet social realism. So what do we come up with? We promote this. Now you have to scratch your head a little bit and say, what is American about this? This is Autumn Rhythms. It's abstract expressionist style. This, as it first came out, was laughable. But we were reacting against what the Soviets were doing and against our previous realist structure, which kind of looks like this, Americana rather than Soviet Unionicana, to make it beautiful and powerful. So we went with the exact opposite and jumped basically from American to Gothic. We skipped constructivism. We skipped surrealism. We skipped Dada. We skip all these other movements as an American-based movement. And we go right from American Gothic with a guy holding a pitchfork about, is this the positive or negative depiction of America in a very tough time? We go from that to the forefront of modern art. So we are going to upraise particularly this individual, Jackson Pollock. Here is what abstract expressionism is. Here's what we're promoting during the time period. Completely anti-Soviet, but the question to ask, is it really American?
If you visit a museum with a collection of modern and contemporary art, you're likely to see works that sometimes elicit the response, "My cat could make that, so how is it art?" A movement called Abstract Expressionism, also known as the New York School, gets this reaction particularly often. Abstract Expressionism started in 1943 and developed after the end of World War II. It's characterized by large, primarily abstract paintings, all over compositions without clear focal points, and sweeping swaths of paint embodying and eliciting emotions. The group of artists who are considered abstract expressionists includes Barnett Newman with his existential zips, William de Kooning, famous for his travestied women, Helen Frankenthaler, who created soak stains, and others. But perhaps the most famous, influential, and head-scratching one was Jackson Pollock. Most of his paintings are immediately recognizable. They feature tangled messes of lines of paint bouncing around in every direction on the canvas. And sure, these fields of chaos are big and impressive, but what's so great about them? Didn't he just drip the paint at random? Can't anyone do that? Well, the answer to these questions is both yes and no. While Pollock implemented a technique anyone is technically capable of regardless of artistic training, only he could have made his paintings. This paradox relates to his work's roots in the surrealist automatic drawings of André Masson and others. These surrealists supposedly drew directly from the unconscious to reveal truths hidden within their minds. Occasionally, instead of picturing something and then drawing it, they let their hands move automatically and would later tease out familiar figures that appeared in the scribbles. And after Pollock moved away from representation, he made drip or action paintings, following a similar premise. Though he developed a signature technique and never looked for images or messages hidden in the works. First, he took the canvas off of the easel and laid it on the floor, a subversive act in itself. Then, in a controlled dance, he stepped all around the canvas, dripping industrial paint onto it from stirrers and other tools, changing speed and direction to control how the paint made contact with the surface. These movements, like the surrealist scribbles, were supposedly born out of Pollock's subconscious. But unlike the surrealists, whose pictures represented the mind's hidden contents, Pollock supposedly made physical manifestations of his psyche. His paintings are themselves signatures of his mind. In theory, anyone could make a painting that is an imprint of their mind. So why is Pollock so special? Well, it's important to remember that while anyone could have done what he did, he and the rest of the New York school were the ones who actually did it. They destroyed conventions of painting that had stood for centuries, forcing the art world to rethink them entirely. But one last reason why Jackson Pollock's work has stayed prominent stems from the specific objects he made, which embody fascinating contradictions. For instance, while Pollock's process resulted in radically flat painted surfaces, the web of painted lines can create the illusion of an infinite, layered depth when examined up close. And the chaos of this tangled mess seems to defy all control, but it's actually the product of a deliberate, though not pre-planned process. These characteristics made Pollock into a celebrity, and within art history, they also elevated him to the mythified status of the genius artist as hero. So rather than evening the playing field for all creative minds, his work unfortunately reinforced a long-standing elitist aspect of art. Elitist, innovative, whatever you choose to call it, the history embedded in abstract expressionism is one that no cat, however talented, can claim.
And so, beyond the surrealist influences from the 1940s and his idea of deep thoughts coming out of Jungian psychology, he's expelled from 2 high schools. He is the hero genius artist that we talk about. He died in a driving accident in the age of 1956. He was an alcoholic at the age of 44. He actually combined Native American sand paintings where you would stand above and actually move around to create these kind of mythological universes to heal the universe, plus the idea of surrealism of his own interior mind. He later on is going to marry Lee Krasner. Now, the remarkable thing about this is that Jackson Pollock gets credit, and he's probably the best abstract expressionist painter of his day, as the last video just told. But at the same time, he is not the innovator. The person who's actually innovating most of the things, coming up with the new ideas, is actually his wife, Lee Krasner. When they take the canvas off, it's not Jackson Pollock's idea initially, it's Lee Krasner. When they go to industrial paint, Lee Krasner. When they actually look at throwing the paint and splotching it on in different kind of tools, that's also a Lee Krasner. And so she generally does not nearly get the credit she deserves. His artworks can sell for up to $200 million. They are large scale, and he's sold as an American genius artist.
Great artists are create magic. It is a sense of wonderment that few people can understand. And here is another one of those great wonders of the world. One of the great, most important artists of all time.
So one of his masterpieces up here on the right is the idea of autumn rhythms. Note on the left, I'm asking you a ridiculous but a true question. The question I'm asking you is this: is one of these feminine and one of these masculine? Which one of these artworks is masculine? Which one is feminine? Is there such thing as a feminine abstract expressionism? And of course, from abstract expressionism standpoint, they would say absolutely yes from the 1950s. So this feminine one does not get promoted. The one that gets promoted is the masculine aggressive. Remember, we had just emerged as a superpower, new kid on the block. We need to show our aggressive masculine power. That look, if this is what our artists can do, look what our military can do. Ha ha ha! Like Tim the Toolman Taylor with being all masculine all the time. And so the abstract expressionism is the idea exactly that. It's the emotional intensity and the self-denial of expressionism with the anti-figurative aesthetic of the European abstract symbols and schools such as Cubism. So they want to get past the anti-figurative. They're looking more in the mind and into kind of Freudian Jungian psychology, very much coming out of the Surrealist movement. So Lee Krasner up here, this from 1908 to 1984. Oh, that one. There we go. Move myself out of the way. Look what they wrote about, and this is note, Clement Greenberg, who is the scholar who actually is the person who discovers Jackson Pollock and really promotes him. From 1960, he says the same thing about these artworks. Look how similar they are, even in terms of color palette and in terms of technique. Here's what he writes about Lee Krasner's. Actually, let's start off with Jackson Pollock. This masterwork, with its simplicity of form and paint, expresses the dominance of masculine aggression, of expressing primal male urges through paint, the rugged masculinity of the American spirit and military. This is an ad for the Marines, right? Expressing primal male urges through paint. Clement Greenberg, what do you see? Oh, look at the white strokes all the way through. What are primal male urges? Well, one of them is going to be aggression, throwing the paint 30 feet, 40 feet. Women just can't throw it that far. The other one is going to be the sexual release of semen. And so while it's not semen, it is representing the sexuality and the promotion of male aggression and primal urges. Don't believe me? Look at what Clement Greenberg said about a female artwork in the same year. This derivative painting lacks the forceful expression of masculine power, as if it was created by a eunuch, someone who doesn't have testicles, can't produce semen, or a drip painter, someone whose semen barely comes out. It's ridiculous. Had Jackson Pollock created this art form with Lee Krasner jointly 10 to 15 years before, we probably would have never heard of him. But he was in the right place at the right time, and we were looking for an American masculine painter to promote forward. This is what we ended with. What's American about this? Nothing. This doesn't say Americana. The turkey table with the family gathering around, that's more Americana. The Mickey Mouse and the Disney and Walt Disney and the idea of the celebration of entertainment culture, celebrity culture, the fact that we will buy anything, look at eBay, Amazon, those are things that are very much American culture. This was the right person at the right time. And as such, the new innovations are Lee Krasner's. Use house paint, paint on the ground, use paint remnants, enormous scale, so we can't do gender equality. Jackson Pollock, the male receives almost all the credit. He's an alcoholic spousal abuser and generally goes and paints when he actually is feeling guilty about beating up his wife, girlfriend, other individuals around. He's seen as the American hero genius. His artwork routinely sells for more than $100 million. His wife handles the business. The wife comes up with all the ideas. She gets very little of the credit. That's what we're looking at when we look at Jackson Pollock and the idea. So be wary when we look at these. The Chris Pat, which is a pretty funny considering what I just showed you with Clement Greenberg. It's literally about the masculine primal urges. is that scene that Chris Pratt's referring to here from Guardians of the Galaxy. Jackson Pollock in Time magazine, here's what he says. When I am in my painting, I'm not aware of what I'm doing. The subconscious, the surrealist tendencies are taking over. It is only a sort of get acquainted period that I see what I have been about. I have no fears about making changes, destroying the image, because the painting has a life of his own. And an over-the-top phrase, I am nature. And this is what's getting promoted. So here are a number of different individual paintings, and you can see kind of the range of different quality of materials that show up throughout his career. That emotional intensity and self-denial of Expressionism out of Van Gogh with the anti-figurative aesthetic. That's what we're looking when we look at abstract Expressionism. So one of the things that shows up is often asked the question, I can do that. The question is, could you do these artworks?
A few weeks ago, we got a question from Trey Willetto, who asked how we respond to people who say, I could have done that. It's so simple about art. For example, Felix Gonzalez Torres. John and I answered that A, you probably actually couldn't do it, and B, you didn't do it. But some of you, like Becky, were dissatisfied. She said, doesn't that imply that the artist has no merit outside of some guy thought about doing this first and now we care about it? It just seems like a really lazy answer. Challenge accepted, Becky. I'll give you a less lazy answer. Okay, if you're looking at a work of art and feel compelled to say, I could do that, or my kid could do that, the first thing you want to do is assess if you really could do that. Take some hard-edge abstraction like this painting by Piet Mondrian that may at first glance seem fairly easy to execute. But if you've tried to use oil paints before, you'll know that it can be really tricky to create such smooth lines and a consistent flat application of color. There's also little details like a line that stops just short of the edge of the canvas that clues you in that no amateur did this. Or Cy Twombly's work gets a lot of heat for looking like a bunch of kids' scribbles. But take a closer look. The quality and character of his line work is astounding. The restrained use of color is exquisite. This isn't Crayola crayon on construction paper. This is pretty masterful handling of paint and pencil and crayon. They may be scribbles, but they're freaking amazing scribbles. And if you still think you could do it, I say give it a try. It could be a really productive exercise to see how something is made, and it may help you learn a new skill or take your work or life in a new direction. But let's move on to what happens when you really could have made the thing in question. If you think about Felix Gonzalez Torres, the example Trey brought up, we can look at a work like Untitled Perfect Lovers from 1991 that pairs two commercially available clocks and synchronizes their time. Yes, you can go to a store, buy two clocks, and hang them on the wall just like this. And you know, it would still be a pretty cool experiment to see how long they stayed synchronized and which runs out of batteries first. But you'd be missing something key here. The title clearly asks you to consider these clocks to be a metaphor for lovers, and how two individuals with hearts beating like the ticking of clocks can be in perfect sync and then inevitably fall out of sync. The title further suggests that the lovers remain perfect even after they've fallen out of sync. But there's even more, because this work wasn't just made by any person at any time. It was made by Felix Gonzalez Torres, who was openly gay and who made the work after his partner Ross was diagnosed with AIDS. Gonzalez Torres's work was overtly and strategically political, and this lovely and heartbreaking work is unquestionably made more resonant when you know that his partner died in 1991 and he died in 1996. His battery lasted just a little bit longer, and if you think a work of art should tell you everything you need to know without the help of wall labels or the like, then I'm probably not going to convince you otherwise. But for me, whether it's the Mona Lisa, a landscape painting in a thrift shop, or an iPhone, every object is created within circumstances that are important and is distributed in ways that add to its meaning. But back to Gonzalez Torres, because we're not quite done with him yet. Many of his works depend on reproducibility, stacks of paper or piles of candy viewers are invited to take. He wanted his work to spread and to be in multiple places at the same time, and to be creative in participation with you, the viewer. With this work, it's not that you could do it, it's that he wants you to. You're invited to, and that's part of the work. It also means his art can exist in perpetuity, beyond the confines of his own life. And you can still experience it today, and maybe take it home with you too. When you say I could do that, what you're really saying, and what I would encourage you to say next time is, this doesn't display a remarkable amount of technical skill, and that's what I really look for in art. I think it's perfectly fine to have a preference for art that displays manual talents unavailable to most. But there's a history of artists beginning in the early 20th century who took on new approaches to material, purposely avoiding showing off technical skill. and for lots of good reasons: to upset the dominant art trends of the time, to question the value of unique objects, to undermine the commercial system of art by creating work that is unlikely to be trophies for the rich, or to reconsider the separation of art and life. There's been some theorization about the so-called de-skilling of art in the 20th century, a word first used to describe the replacement of skilled laborers by technologies and less skilled workers who operate them. Industrialization also had a profound effect on art, introducing new methods of reproduction, and we can't forget about the dawn of photography that certainly called into question the relevance of spending loads of time learning how to paint something realistically. Rather than devote their lives to mastering a particular medium, some artists began to push the boundaries of those mediums and even forgo them altogether. There's sculpture that is purposefully unmonumental, paintings purposefully non-virtuosic, drawings purposefully simple. It's not that these things don't take skill, they just take different kinds of skill: research, deduction, collaboration, exploration of new materials, radical thought. Just as we value professions other than skilled labor, we should also value work by artists focused not just on craftsmanship, but on the effective execution of good ideas. It's the thought they bring to the form, or have others bring to the form, and not just the form itself. Next time you're compelled to say, "I could do that," I think you should stop yourself and ask, why did they do that? What are the circumstances that led me to not doing that, and them being so driven to make the thing, that they not only thought of the idea, but then completed it and found an audience for it? What are the social, political, and economic circumstances surrounding their doing this thing? You can still admire impressive technical skill, but you can also open yourself up to appreciating a much wider world of art.
And so one of the other individuals that shows up that's an abstract expressionism is William de Kooning. And he's really known for, on some level, this very brutalized attempt at deconstructing the objectified female body. This is his women's series, and there are 7 of them. And here are 4 of them. And you can see kind of the brutal nature that he takes. And the question is this anti-woman, or just a looking way at different colors of paint, different ways of actually depicting the female form? Because note, he challenges all the notions. We do not have that curvilinear Aphrodite of Canidos form. He is one of the first artists that actually challenged that form. But no, they're also aggressive, like we saw with Picasso as well. So it's led many people to actually argue about the misogyny of this, when it might just be the application of paint. That is something for you to consider yourself as you look at these. Now, during this process, because their abstract expressions is going to be very pro-masculine, we are going to have a group of feminist artists that are going to have a response to the very promotion of masculine abstract expressionism. I mean, it's being promoted by a spousal abuser that is an alcoholic that feels bad after beating up his spouse or girlfriend, and then paints literally on some level as a cathartic. So we have 2 women in particular who are going to use their body for action. And so the first one is going to be Carolee Schneemann, Interior Scroll. She wrote a poem about her vagina and the power of her vagina, rolled it up, put it inside of her vagina, and then read it in one of the first performances of performance art as it came out within it. The Perez Art Museum actually owns this piece of work, and so sometimes it's out. Janine Antoni does Loving Care, where she actually paints with her hair the same way the abstract expressionism argue that masculine, whereas women have more hair. She actually could create large-scale roofs that show up. And so I don't want to show you that, but I'm going to show you the In Loving Care by Janine Antoni and the painting with the hair. And this is a response directly to the abstract expression, specifically of Pollock. So there's a feminist female body empowerment response here as well. And I'll go a little farther into it so we can see. So both are responses that females can do this active gesturalism painting as well. Both come out in the aftermath of abstract expressionism. Then we're going to have neo-abstract expressionism by such artists as Kai Guoqing, and he's a Chinese artist. And the Kai actually, as he's doing, uses gunpowder to create these beautiful So colored gunpowder used to create these beautiful either pictures, panoramas, or paintings using gunpowder itself. The last movement we'll talk about within this time period, but I'll come back and spend some time as we introduce this next time, will actually be minimalism. And minimalism is the idea of taking the very bare minimal essence, breaking down art into its ultimate color, line, form, shape, or texture, but really to get at either the idea of just an experiential, or it could be an element of spiritual. So we have artists such as Frank Stella with Die van Hoek, the Farnsworth House minimalist architecture that shows up here, and Richard Serra, really breaking art down to its bare minimums as it shows up. And that minimalism is largely going to be borrowed from the Zen aesthetic that comes out of Japanese art. And so in Die van Hoek, for example, raise the banner, the 3 inches that these lines are apart is exactly the stretcher marks that are apart in an actual piece of stretching a piece of canvas. And so he basically marked out where those stretchers were. And so he's trying to do as minimal as he possibly can while still making an art about a conceptual framework, something in the real world. Vietnam Veterans Memorial later on is going to be an abstract, the idea of a minimalist idea of a war monument. It was considered very unheroic, particularly because it's a Chinese female immigrant making a war monument. And during this time period when we had very anti-Asian feelings, even though she's Chinese and not Vietnamese from the Vietnam War memorial, she was pro-communist. She was an art grad student, so one of the most famous war monuments of all time. She was still a grad student at Yale. And so a female for male war caused all sorts of controversies. And yet the reflective character, what people said, it kind of looks like a scar on the earth rather than the scar in America of the people that we lost with a war that we didn't really win. It came to a standstill, was also very controversial. And so if you compare, look at the powerful heroic from winning a battle from Michelangelo to Rodin, the individuals giving up their lives is an expressionist in order to save their people. The heroes of the triangular composition that shows up in the Iwo Jima to this very reflective, very crying, one of the more kind of contemporary art museums. My dad actually, who I almost never see cry, cried when he went here because the names of the 68,000 soldiers are in chronological area of when they died. And so you literally have to look around all these different names to find out where your friend, where your relative happens to be, and it's heartbreaking. People still leave, and there's airport hangars full of things that left. Even today, you'll go to see people leave flowers and all sorts of other things. And so the question becomes, is this minimalism and abstract expressionism? Is color field really an exception or really a part of this? This is the point that your book makes, by Clifford Steele, by Mark Rothko, by Jackson Pollock, by Stella by Barnett Newman. Is that abstract expressionism what leads us to minimalism? Is color field in that same vein, or is there something different about color field? Because abstract expression really is the idea of abstraction to get an expressionist element. But color field does the same thing, except color field sometimes will take on very dark tones and sometimes wonderful. So abstract expressionism is emotional intensity and self-denial with anti-figurative aesthetic. Minimalism is a reducing art to its bare essentials. Note how close those two are. And the question is color field the emotional intensity and self-denial with anti-figurative aesthetic? In one level it is. It's also reducing art to its bare essentials. So where do we put color field? Is it one of these art movements or a separate art movement? The most famous individual from this time period is going to be Mark Rothko, who was born Russian Jew as Marcus Rothkowitz, with Jews blamed for all sorts of things, such as, even the death of Christ still. He's unaffiliated with any art movement, though he likes color field. He has leftist politics and unions, comes from a low-income family, feigned personal isolation and misunderstanding, and eventually he's going to commit suicide on the same day as one of his paintings was accepted into Tate Modern. He wants to use art as a tool for emotion and religion, coming out of his early career and the myths coming out of surrealism begin with, and art to relieve modern man's spiritual emptiness, very similar to Nietzsche. The idea of we need art as a spiritual essence, very similar to the Suprematists and even the Steele out of Pierre Mondrian. Here's his painting technique. you'll see it's actually rather complicated. We often don't give him his due. And his paintings do sell for about $70 million. They're large scale. And as you see, the darker his color palette, the closer it is that we are getting to his suicide in the early 1970s.
In the 1950s, Mark Rothko explored how forms could float in space, sometimes advancing toward you, other times quietly receding away from you. Now, by looking at his paintings, there's a number of ways that we can discern how these effects are achieved. However, Rothko was notoriously hermetic about his studio practices. We don't know all that much about what materials he used and how exactly he did it, but by looking closely, we can learn a lot. Now, how these forms are liberated in space, how they even have this ability to move.
And many people say you really do need to see these up live. They just don't come around in a digitized surface. And I think that is actually true. I never really appreciated a Rothko until I was a 30-year-old that saw them live, and then I was overwhelmed by them.
Almost totally overpainted by a dark burgundy. It appears that Rothko often flared out paint one layer over another, and as we look at the edges, we realize that there's kind of a buzzing sensation as these two colors compete for our attention and almost vibrate against one another. To further allow these forms to float off and away from the surface of the canvas, Rothko often softened the corners of these forms. And here we see something called a turpentine burn, where the artist likely took some solvent on the rag and scrubbed back into the surface of the canvas, blending all of those colors together, meanwhile erasing a hard corner, which would visually locate that form in space. In addition to leaving hints of these colors around the edges of forms, crucially, Rothko allows you to see through veils of paint because he painted so thinly. Now, let me show you exactly how Rothko painted so thinly. Rothko would add so much turpentine to his paint that he would stain the canvas, less painting on the canvas than really pushing his paint into it as a stain. Because these stains are so thin, you're able to read one color quite literally through another. In thicker areas of paint, you see the overlayer. In thinner areas of that overlayer, you begin to see the underlayer. And because Rothko layered color over color over color, any given zone is infinitely complex. Rothko thought that if the viewer properly experienced his paintings, that he or she would very often cry. We're quite literally talking about a painter who wanted his viewers to experience the kind of emotions that he very likely did himself.
Remember, he's going through depression for most of his life.
To be emotionally moved, perhaps even to cry when listening to music. However, it's very rare that visual art can evoke those same emotions. Rothko, if you will, is competing on the territory of music, trying to evoke very, very strong emotions through paint. The experience of viewing this painting is a very somber one. It lacks resolution. Although it's very quiet, although it's a quite beautiful painting, it's a painting that never has a finality to it. It's one that almost unravels in time.
And so those Mark Rothkos from 1903 about 1970, on average, they average about $50 million, plus they develop appreciation. This is one of the most sought after artists in the modern day world. And you really do. Here's a number of them. You can see the lighter ones are from earlier in his career. And as he gets later in his career, he gets more suicidal, we get darker to darker, where it almost goes on black on black. Now, the other individual that I want to show you from the time period is Barnett Newman. And I will tell you, I normally really do dislike Barnett Newman's work. He has these ideas of these things that are called zip. But the question is this the most successful color field artwork ever? This is actually called Stations of the Cross by Barnett Newman. And it's a series of 12 paintings. And what it is the first station, the third station, supposed to show you the stations of the cross that Christ underwent within the process. So look at the first station, the third station, the sixth station, and then later on the 10th station. And what he's trying to do is that you consider this in terms of the idea of what Jesus went through and are considering much of watching that, even though I am an atheist, it's the idea of people actually tormenting another human body to that level seems incomprehensible. And so that's what we're looking at. There's a Rothko Gallery in the National Gallery of Art's East Wing. It's right above the other wing, which actually shows the Stations of the Cross developing here. And so we'll come back and look at some of these other ones later on. But what I want to do is make sure that we have time to talk about modern art definition then, the movements and the aesthetics. And so if we look at it, from 1900 to 1910, we have Fauvism, then we have Cubism, Futurism, the Steel, Suprematism, Blue Rider, Dadaism, Conceptual Art, Surreal, Abstract Expressionism, Color Field, and Minimalism. And the question I need you to do is to figure out modern art and its definition. What do modern art share in terms of their aesthetics and subject matter? What is Fauvism about in terms of its aesthetics? What is the subject matter, and does it mean anything from this time period? And that's really what we're looking at. And once we get those two things together and we can kind of look at them from similarities, we can come up with what a definition in the modern art movement is. And so the idea that I could do that, why do many people hate modern art today? Art can mean whatever I think it means. How do these play out? So what I could do is take a minute, and we'll do this in class, and pause and have you write out the aesthetics and subject matter from each of these time movements. So go ahead. I'll pause, or you can pause the video and I'll move on. So when you are ready, we can come back and look at it. So when we look at things like Fauvism, the aesthetics would be bright color, and the subject matter means it does not matter. Cubism, the simplification of geometric forms from monochrome, does not matter. Futurism, energy, subject matter, does not matter. And so modern art 1900 to 1960 basically means we are exploring the basic elements of art. The subject become irrelevant. So the whole point of this is that a lot of this art is going to lose its power. Art is no longer about promoting gods and prophets and individuals into being good human beings and the pursuit of happiness and the pursuit of love. This is really art for art's sake. And so art in many cases loses its power. So in the next movement, postmodern art, art is going to try to regain its power. And that is largely why many people hate modern art. It's this idea that, well, I could do that. Why do many people hate art today? Art can be whatever I think it means. And there is an element of all of this. And that actually does bother many people in the world, is that if you can make any of these things, you just happen not to be the first, then what people say is, well, I'm just looking for the new thing. I don't need any talent to be an artist. And that's just simply not the case. Most of these artists, even when they chose not to use the particular realistic thing that people evaluate as talent, they did develop this. And almost all of these individuals had gone to art school. That's the cost of admission. So I hope that everything is going well. Have a wonderful day, and I am actually going to stop our lovely video view. Goodbye.